Hello everybody, it's Mrs. Pound and I am back with more about Chapter 4.2, Oceans. Today's topic from Section 423 is tides. So our objectives today are to explain how the gravitational forces of the moon and sun produce ocean tides and to contrast the two basic types of tides and relate tides to the position of the moon and the sun. Now, if you have ever been to the ocean or maybe even a very large lake like the Great Lakes, a beach there, you have noticed maybe if you were at the beach that you put out your towel and you put it in a certain spot and maybe after a while the water was up to your towel. What was going on? Well, you have experienced high and low tides. So, where do tides come from? It's from the exertion of gravity on Earth's water, on Earth's oceans. So, the moon exerts a stronger gravitational force on Earth's tides than the sun. Both the moon and the sun affect the tides, but because the moon is closer to the Earth, it has more gravity. And what the moon does is the moon pulls the water toward it and it kind of elongates the shape of the water around the earth, almost kind of like a football shape. Okay, and the points of the football are pointing toward the moon and away from the moon. It just kind of flattens it out, and that's where your high tides are, and the low tides are on the flatter parts of the football. And the earth moves underneath, so that bulge effect is pretty constant there facing towards the moon, but the earth moves underneath, and so that water shifts, and that's what forms the tides. Now, there is a tidal range. This is the difference in water height between high and low tide. In general, there are 2 high tides and 2 low tides every day on Earth. And that is because of the position of the Earth moving underneath, and you have one about a little over 12 hours apart from each other. Now, there are 2 types, special types of tides other than high and low tide. There's a spring tide. This is a tide that occurs when the sun, moon, and earth are aligned. And I have this water here that's kind of up a little bit to show basically that a spring tide produces relatively high tides. So these are very high and very low tides in the widest daily tidal range. And what I want you to do to show that you're listening to this video is circle full and new moon. So go ahead and circle full moon and new moon. There are 2 times a month that a spring tide occurs, and that is because the moon and the sun are lined up. And so that gravitational pull adds up and makes these tides especially high and especially low. The other type of tide is a neap tide, and this is a tide that occurs when the sun and moon are at right angles to each other. So these produce moderate tides in the lowest daily tidal ranges. And so what you can see here, and go ahead and circle first quarter moon and third quarter moon. This will show me that you're listening to the video. And what you can see here is the sun, and notice that it is less of an effect than the moon, but it does have some effect on the tide. The sun has its tide. The moon has its tide, and so it has this moderating effect. They do not add together, and so there is less of a difference when you look at this diagram between the low tides and the high tides for the day. And these are not the only factors. The topography of the area has a lot to do with it. So in some areas you will have much higher or lower tides than in other areas. In some areas you might even experience just one low and high tide a day, depending on the topography. So our objectives today were to explain how the gravitational forces of the moon and sun produce ocean tides, and to contrast the 2 basic types of tides and relate tides to the position of the moon and the sun. So don't forget your 5 questions, and I will be back with more about the oceans.